So welcome everybody. As we just announced, this is a panel discussion around the state of Colorado's migration to the cloud, with probably is the most critical system that the state runs, which is their integrated eligibility system. It's called CBMS. My name is Dave Savino. I'm a managing director with Deloitte Consulting in the cloud engineering practice. My role in this presentation is the moderator. The stars of this presentation are to my left. In terms of the process, we're going to try and get through which we think is a lot of interesting content in about 35 minutes. We want to save 15 minutes for questions. So if you could just hold your questions to that piece, that'd be helpful for the presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce to my left really the architect and the vision behind that migration and a modernization story. David McCurdy to my left, if you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello everybody, my name is David McCurdy. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for the Governor's Office of Information Technology in Colorado. I manage technology for all the branches of the governor, so that's Health and Human Services, the CDOT, Medicaid, all the way across the board.
Yeah, my name is Ryan Inman. I'm a senior manager with Deloitte's Cloud Engineering Group. I had the privilege of leading this migration to AWS for David, and we had some pretty interesting challenges I think you'll hear about today, and hopefully you take away some knowledge from some of the lessons we learned.
Great. So thank you. So before we dive into the content, I think it's important we start with the story, and it was really in the tagline for this presentation, and that tagline was, wait, it's already been done. And that was really the genesis for having this presentation today. And so David, maybe you can share with us the genesis behind that story.
Yeah, so after all the work, all the good work the team's put in, the tagline comes from the night of the cutover, and it had to do with one of our county offices calling in to check on the status of the migration, and their response was, wait, it's done. And that was pretty much the tagline all night long of these counties, 64 counties calling in and asking for the status, because with any type of cutover like this, there could be problems, but it was so clean and so efficient, it surprised everybody, including myself and the overall team. But whenever you can hear something like that from your customers, it's great news.
Yeah, it's outstanding. As you're going to hear, this is a very complex system. It's got a lot of moving parts to it. So to actually have that experience, there was a lot of planning behind that to make that happen, a lot of strong execution. So we'll go into some details around that. So let's go ahead and start off with the reason why you guys started on that journey. So I think to help the audience, if you could explain what CBMS is and why it's so important to the state. In addition, cover at a high level the goals that you were trying to achieve with the modernization.
Yeah, so CBMS stands for Colorado Benefits Management System. It was a system that was put together quite some time ago, and it really services benefits enrollment and management across a wide variety of state and federal systems. So everything from food assistance to TANF to Medicaid to cash assistance. 14 different state and federal agencies that the system services. So I'll kind of move into why this project now, coming into the state in 2014, the system had gone through quite a lot of turmoil, and one of my jobs was to stabilize it, to kind of envision what it was going to be in the future. It was going through a different kind of migration. It was called a cloud migration, but it was more of a managed service migration. The code set at that time in 2014 was 14 million lines of code. And it was just this behemoth. It's servicing kind of the residents of Colorado, the people that needed it most, but it's just behemoth system. So what are we going to do with it? So some of the goals were to improve end user experience. We were looking at cloud and SaaS-based models, increased development agility. You think about 14 million lines of code. Anytime there's a major code change or a law change or federal change, we're going to go find all these changes inside the code set. The code set evolved from this COBOL, I call it Java version of COBOL, JOBOL. So it was just this mishmash of years of iterating on top of the system. So we put together a multi-year strategy that involved moving the infrastructure to the cloud, which is what we're going to talk about here, as well as changing the front end, which I talked a little bit about earlier at one of our Salesforce conferences, but just a complete system to change how we deliver to our customers.
Fantastic. So I think it would be worth it we talk about the architecture a little bit, because of this will explain the complexity of what the team was dealing with. So you've talked about it's a multi-cloud, and it's also a hybrid cloud solution. If we could talk through why you chose this architecture, and then some of the challenges the opportunities the architecture provide, but also some of the challenges that we had to overcome.
Hey, Ryan, you want to take it? You want me to take it?
Yeah, if you, go ahead and kick it off and I'll
Yeah, so
fill in the blanks.
So you're dealing with hundreds of servers. You're dealing with 14 million lines of code. All that current state lived in state data centers. So where are you going to take it? I had roughly a $4 or $5 million bill come in to replace all that hardware. And so we had been a cloud first state for some time, but what that really meant before is we were focusing on software as a service. We were moving stuff up into clouds and hosting it kind of natively in SaaS-based offerings. We were looking at doing more infrastructure as a service. We had started off with a smaller project with a similar architecture called CHATS, which is our child welfare system. And so we're kind of iterating to this moment. There was also other factors, like you had the federal match coming into play. So all things were lining up to this decision. But why kind of hybrid? One, Salesforce, we had committed a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of development, matured the team, so we wanted to expand on that. I wanted to reduce that code set down. We achieved that goal with using Salesforce, so that's part of that hybrid cloud. There's some stuff Salesforce didn't do, or we wanted done slightly differently. For example, we were hosting Oracle databases. We didn't want, as part of this migration, to blow up the entire world and rewrite all the code. So we were hosting Oracle, all the middleware servers, ancillary interfaces through AWS. And then there's some stuff that we still have in our state cloud, such as interfaces to the mainframe, interfaces to banks, stuff like that, third-party state systems. So that's why the hybrid cloud architecture, and I think it's kind of a modern architecture. We are developing this stack across multiple agencies, so we're trying to repeat this process and get really good at it.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, this application will be a multi-cloud app where the front end lives in Salesforce and the back end lives in AWS. And we're going to talk about the migration approach, but this was a phased project, with phase 0 being let's get everything into AWS, and then phase 1 and 2 being the incremental modernization to Salesforce. So we'll talk more about that, but so understand when we talk about the lift and shift migration, that was the first phase of the project, which is complete. And then the ongoing work that's happening now is to get the modern UI put in using Salesforce.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, one of the guiding principles in developing this, you also had to develop shared services. So this wasn't just about CBMS, it was actually put in place a platform that you could use for other applications as the state matured their migration to the cloud.
Absolutely. One of the things I inherited was 1,200 different ways of application development across 17 agencies. And so we had to make some choices. I'm not saying they're all perfect choices, but this is one of the stacks we invested in, which is AWS, Salesforce, MuleSoft is a key part of these stacks. Some of our vendor partners are core pieces of these stacks. So trying to replicate that and achieve success over and over and over again.
Okay, great. So now the challenges. A lot of opportunity there, but there was lots of challenges to get there. And it was a very short period of time that the team had to actually execute the migration. So Ryan, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So the rest of this will be primarily focused on the migration to AWS, which was our phase 0. We've got some impressive numbers up here, but they don't really do justice to the complexity of these type of applications. There's just, like David said, there's a lot going on. One of the biggest challenges we faced is we have about 100 external partner interfaces across maybe 20 different partners. So I mean, obviously moving this application while not breaking all of those and the migration strategy around how you actually move those was quite a challenge. We made some very smart decisions from an executive level. I mean, the way we conquered that challenge with our timeline was we didn't try to migrate those as part of go live. We identified interfaces that were required for our security ATC. We migrated those beforehand. The rest we left on-prem. We left a very small footprint. We went live, and now we're cutting those over. And the trick with those is it's a logistics nightmare at the end of the day. I mean, it takes a lot of coordination with different agencies and different vendors and whitelisting and certificate exchange, so it was not feasible that we were gonna get 100 of those moved in 4 months, 5 months, right? So that was an interesting challenge. I'd say the next piece is, for anybody who hasn't done a lift and shift type migration, the first thing you really have to look at is you got to take stock on your COTS products. CBMS has quite a large COTS footprint, I would say. And so one of the first things we had to do was kind of go through, figure out what all those were, and really go and do a lot of license investigation and negotiation and all kinds of other things. I think there's probably a misconception that if you pick something up and you drop it in the cloud, the licensing just automatically goes with it. Unfortunately, that's not the case a lot of times. And licensing models don't always fit, right? I mean, sometimes you're hardware-based licensing, you move to the cloud, you're now virtual core licensed, which is a totally different situation. So we had a lot of work up front to kind of identify those types of pieces in our planning phase and work through them. We have some additional stuff in here. I don't want to say honorable mention because we have entire slides dedicated to these, but we had a pretty complex database migration. We had to take something off an Oracle Exadata and move it into AWS. We also had compliance requirements, so this whole process we're going through, the whole design is based in security because we had to achieve ATC to go live. So, quite a few challenges there. We're going to get into more details on a lot of these, so I'll save a little bit of time and wait till we dive in a little
maybe
bit.
just a slight translation. So ATC on the state side is equivalent to an ATO on the federal side for those of you who do your work in the federal market. So, and you're familiar with that. That's not an easy process.
Right.
It's a lengthy process. Great. So let's dive into some of the solutions around this. We had talked about the infrastructure shared services portion of this.
Yes.
And with the hybrid and the multi-cloud solution, the network suddenly becomes very, very important in service delivery.
Right.
So why don't we talk about how you tackle that problem?
Yeah, so this was a unique challenge, right, because of the architecture. So at the end of the day, if I talked about the objectives of the network design, we have a Salesforce and AWS, an application that's going to be sitting in two different locations, right? And really the goal there was to minimize the latency and try to achieve an SLA as close as possible. That's a little bit challenging, right, when you're looking at a SaaS. I mean, typically you're going to be going across the internet. You're not going to have any guarantees on that connection. We actually architected a cloud connectivity solution that co-located our AWS data center, our Salesforce workloads, and our cloud on-ramp. So we were able to get about 2 milliseconds of latency between those two pieces. So that also allowed us to get an SLA pretty much up to the door of Salesforce. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're not familiar with how you do that, Salesforce doesn't really offer a direct connect. You just kind of drop in on their doorstep. So you've got an SLA right up to that drop in. So that was a big objective for the network design. It probably drove most of the design. Of course, we had a heavy dependency on prem for not only just moving everything up to the cloud, but also all of the application interdependencies. I mean, tons of operational tooling is not, when you move one application, you're not moving all of your tooling with it. So all that tooling is going to stay on-prem, all of our security tooling and monitoring. So we had to, build a robust, redundant disaster recovery type solution that could support all of that for the long term, and also set up shared services, right? This was the first thing we identified that was not going to be a CBMS specific solution. It didn't make sense. We did 10 gig end-to-end redundant cloud on-ramp facilities that are co-located halfway across the country from each other. So we put a lot of effort into that network design, and it just didn't make sense for it to be one app, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is the state standard for all connectivity to the cloud. It's a button-click provision at this point, so that's a really important piece when you look at your cloud architecture.
Yeah. So in the end, not an issue. The network was not an issue.
The network is not
Well, it's not an issue now, right?
Yeah, not now.
All the plan. I'm a big latency guy, right? And so I was very concerned with moving an application this big that serves so many customers, essentially 1,000 miles away from the customers now. And how is it going to respond? How is it going to work from a performance perspective? We'll talk about that a little more at the end, but the performance was better than anticipated across the board.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Great. So that took care of sort of the overall architecture and some of the key architectural decisions that had to be made with the migration for the services. Next comes in the timeline around this, and as everybody can see on the screen, this is a pretty tight timeline. There was time up front to do some planning, but essentially the migration had to happen in about 5.5 months to get this done. Dave, if you could share with us some of the drivers behind that time frame, and I think some of the federal folks will understand those windows you have to operate under, and I think they'd appreciate your experience around that.
Sure. So when you're a state working through moving these kind of data sets, you're working with a whole host of federal partners, and you're asking for permission to move. You're asking them to verify your security best practices, where you're going to live, how their data is going to be protected. You got to go through all these checks and balances, and you got to do that for essentially every single federal agency, and at the same time comply with state rules, our state cybersecurity standards, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, as Ryan was just talking about, you're designing a network that's going to work broader than just this one application. In that, we also had federal funding deadlines, right? So you have to deliver by X timeframes. We did this project inside the Affordable Care Act, so we were going after 90-10 or 75-25 funding for it. So we had all these kind of restrictions in terms of timeline, and at the same time, you're telling your customers, hey, if we're not ready, we're not going to take you live because we're not going to put this system at risk. So the ability for the team to get together, put this design together, execute on the design, and then come in. I think we were 2 weeks past our original deadline, exactly. But I think that 2 weeks was well worth it. And then to hear the success on the back end is a credit to all the teams that work together.
Yeah. And we had one really interesting kind of hard stop right at the beginning of October, which was open enrollment. So we had a freeze at that point. So we really had, when we hit September, it was we were either going or we were going to be pushing it out through the end of the year. So that was a pretty hard requirement for getting us live in the cloud.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you a little bit about the process we used, if that's what you want to hear, and how we achieved that velocity, right? So at Deloitte, we call this our cloud migration factory approach, and what this is it's just a methodology for doing migration. You can see on the screen, I don't have to read all these off, but I mean, at the end of the day, the goal here is that we've taken lessons learned from doing these in the past and applied them, right? And we've documented this, and we've come up with this process, and we bought some tools to help us, enable us to do discovery and migration. So it's really the culmination of all of that. At the end of the day, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on why you need to do a discovery. I'm sure everybody here knows that, and specifically in the context of this application, I mean, you really have, when you do a lift and shift, you're taking all of your interdependencies with you, right? You're not refactoring whatever communication you've got on-prem it's going to have to still exist in the future state. So you really need to get a good understanding of your application, all of that kind of communication patterns, but also just looking at, you don't want to go in super over provisions, so you want to look at your utilization, once again, get an idea of your software products that you're running. So that's kind of that discovery phase. For us, we have, we use our Adavision tool for that, but we also do some static code analysis with Storm Fury, just to check the code for things like static IPs. Standardized architecture really is just about, we've developed architectures that kind of, I want to say, they accelerate you for compliance, right? We know they're compliant, we've used them, so we're not going to go and re-architect at every client. We know we use a transit VPC, we have firewalls, we have layer 7 security capabilities. These are what allowed us to get ATC in a pretty short amount of time. So we want to bring those lessons forward and we kind of just stamp these out to some extent. There's some level of customization, obviously, but at a high level, the principles are the same for the design. The migration workflow, this is an interesting one that I'm going to spend a minute on. So what really enabled us to achieve velocity is when you look at a migration, okay, one of the first, and we actually learned some of this the hard way, right? There's a lot of stakeholders involved that you don't even realize when you first start down this path. You go, okay, I have managed services vendors in the mix, I have security people, I've got my operations teams, I've got all the application architects, I've got my developers. You really have to go through and understand all of their requirements. And then what we do is we compile that into a workflow, and then we say, when we kick off a migration, we're going to go through a checklist of each one of these teams, and we're going to track that migration on my individual server basis is how we did it. And really what happens is at the end of the migration, you hit the last stage of that workflow, you take a backup, you call that finished. Before we implemented that process, we recycled a couple of servers, to be generous, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you get halfway to the finish line and somebody goes, you missed the security team, they need to put their agents on, you're sending a server back to the beginning, right? Because you need to retest it, you need to make sure there was no impact. So that process, I mean, when we put that in place, we created a whole new problem, which was, we were moving servers through so fast, they were just queuing up. We had people with 100 servers in their queue because it streamlined the process and it put a lot of accountability around where the bottlenecks were in visibility. So that was a really cool process. Automated security testing, we just did some scripting in AWS config to check for compliance items, and we would generate reports and remediate. Yeah. So just to help us get to ATC and maintain compliance, that was...
Yeah, but still critical, right?
Very critical. I don't want to make light of it, but you know, it was something we did on a regular basis just to ensure that when we got to independent verification, which is when they send in the external auditor to come in and look at your app stack, we weren't going to have any surprises, right? We don't want somebody to walk in and go, oh, 3 of these servers aren't encrypted. That's a big, then you're just, once again, you're going back and doing those activities.
Yeah.
So we put some automation around that process to help us.
So by the end, I mean, how many servers were you guys migrating per week?
Per week, I would say we could have easily migrated 50 a week. I mean, we were doing migration waves, so there was never a point when you had to migrate 100 in a week. It just didn't make sense with the schedule.
Yep.
We had development going on in there all the time, so it was a challenge was figuring out, okay, we're going to cut SIT tomorrow because we need to get code into it by Wednesday, right? So I mean, that was always an interesting challenge. But yeah, we could have probably put 100 servers a week through this process. I would guess. There didn't seem to be any limit to manpower would have been the problem at some point.
Okay. And David, I'm assuming you were happy with the progress we made from week 1 to week 15. So.
Yeah, what he doesn't say is right around September 2017, I made a major architectural change to the stack. And we had been thinking about this process for 6 months to a year. I mean, no heavy design, but we were saying, hey, do we want to do this? Does it look right? And we were pretty firm on one of the core pieces of the stack, and we, around the September timeline, I was like, nope, we're not doing that. We're going to go this direction. And we were able to build that into this model and deliver on it. So it's very important.
Great. Great. Next topic. We talked about the data migration, the database migration. I think it's worth spending a few minutes talking about this. So this is a fairly significant challenge. So obviously you made some strategic choices in how you wanted to do databases. You want to run databases in the cloud. You're going to run Oracle in the cloud. What were some of the thought process behind that and some of the challenges that you faced?
I mean, this is the application, right? This is all the resident data. This is all the data that makes up the application. So getting this right was going to make the project ultimately successful. And we had challenges previously with the DR strategy around this data and where we were replicating it to. There's lots of questions about what do we do with the Exadata? Do we put them in some type of managed service that's next to these Amazon data centers? All that kind of thinking was talked about. Like, do we move it to another database platform? Ultimately speaking, you have enough moving parts. You're moving hundreds of servers, you're moving interfaces, you're moving all that kind of stuff. It didn't make sense to think about changing Oracle. And frankly, Oracle was servicing us well. We weren't having performance issues. The primary issue when you're dealing with Oracle and Microsoft or whatever is what are the licenses you own and where can you take them and how is it going to look? But when you work through those issues, when you work through the partners, you get the strategy of how you're actually going to physically move the data and how long that's going to take and what's your cutover plan. This was the right decision. It just reduced enough complexity from the project. It allowed us to feel safe in our cutover. So
yeah, and I think one of the key design decisions was to actually get off of Exadata, and then use more general purpose processors. So if you could talk about that challenge.
Yeah, I probably lost a little bit of sleep on this one for sure. Yep. I mean, I think we have some really smart database people out at Colorado. And this was flagged right out the gate as the technical challenge to figure out, right? You know, they had just moved to the Exadata not too many years before, and saw a pretty drastic improvement in database performance. So obviously we didn't want to diminish that when we took it to the cloud. So you know, the process we went through was, I mean, like I said, we had some really good database people. But here's my recommendation when you go down this path. Number one, it can be done. We did it. We're getting very similar performance characteristics, and I think you'll be really surprised when you hear what that architecture looks like. But AWS has some very, very strong people in this topic, right? And we were fortunate enough to have them almost in our project, I mean, at least on a weekly basis, but really, really at hand for all these big architectural kind of challenging decisions like this. So they provided us some expertise on that around Exadata architecture and stuff like that. So, we came up with some candidate architectures. I'll book in the two. We had several. One was complete general purpose, M5, GP2s, no IOP provision drives. I'm sure everybody's saying there's no way that's what they ended up on. The other one was we bought bare metal i3s that had, 10 gigs of ephemeral local storage, tons of memory, tons of CPU, and that was the ace in the hole, right? So it was, okay, we're gonna try this, but we're gonna keep this in our back pocket in case this other architecture doesn't work. And we had a few others in there. But surprisingly enough, we were able to make this work on the GP2, no IOP provision drives, on just M5 general hardware, and get very similar performance characteristics. And what I'll tell you is, if you lay your disks out properly, you can get a lot of IOPS with GP2, and with some of the Oracle technologies that are out there. So that was a pretty big engineering feat, and we were really proud of this particular piece. The core database that's on here is the 7 terabyte online database. That was the one that's at the heart of the entire CBMS application. So that was the one to solve for. We migrated quite a few, but that was the one we really had to engineer, I would say. So how did we get the data there? We did Snowball, right? And one of the things about doing, anybody who hasn't seen a Snowball, it's not the most pretty box. It's huge. It looks like it could explode a bomb blast, or survive a bomb blast. But we had a couple of them. We ordered one, and then we ordered a backup. And eventually what we did is we just backed up our database. We shipped it. Once we got it there, we had to put it back in sync. That was a bit of a process to get it synced back up. It was offline for probably a week in that process. So, but really the bread and butter of this was, after we got it there, we recognized that the problem to solve for was the batch. That was the most database intensive process. So we assumed if we could get the batch performance kind of back in line with what it was on-prem, then online was going to be fine. Yeah. So we went through a process of doing like-for-like batch testing for about a month and a half. So we would take the batch process on-prem, we'd run it in the cloud. How do we compare? Maybe do a little tuning, do that again. We did that for a month, and I would say that was kind of the secret sauce that got the database to perform where we needed it to go live.
Yeah.
So it was a pretty impressive migration.
We could probably talk about this all day. So this was the challenge, I think. Everyone would agree this was the challenge, and the team solved it.
Well, they talked for months about it, right?
Yeah.
But we went back to my healthcare days where you'd fly Meditech systems to your central data center, because that's the only way that you can move them. And I do think this kind of, for large data sets, right? Especially if you're going to go to Amazon, it seems the least risky, because you take a good hard cut and then you migrate the data and you do a sync to clean it up.
There it is.
You don't have to wait. You don't have to wait too long to see the success.
Exactly.
Success or failure right away.
And this is very sensitive data as well, too. So
absolutely.
It's the crown jewels. So this is, as we've talked about, this is a bit of a softball question: automation and infrastructure as code. Something you need to do to take advantage of the cloud. But from your perspective, what was the driving reason behind making sure this was in place on the day one of cutover?
So we have a cloud first policy. It's published. I talked to my team a lot about what cloud was. When I joined in 2014, there's all these people, there's documents everywhere. I already talked about the previous data center being cloud. There's nothing about it that was cloud, right? And so for people that haven't read the NIST guidelines on cloud, when I talk to my team and I talk to Deloitte, our partners, that we are achieving very specific goals. We are going to deliver an automated environment that's flexible, it's scalable, it's measured, it's all those things that NIST defines around cloud. So automation out of the gate was key. One of the things we had heard from Health and Human Services other than just kind of stop buying hardware every 4 or 5 years, is why is it taking so long to spin up additional servers, get access to things. If you're going to compete in 2019, you need to be able to provision workloads fairly quickly. They need to be hardened out of the gate, and so automation does this for you, right? And so whether you're building a hybrid cloud on-prem, whether you're doing up in AWS, I think you have to build with this in mind right out of the gate.
Yeah. And how important was this to have the conversation with the accrediting body to get you through ATC in essentially 5 months?
Very important.
Yeah.
It's very. They want to. The federal agencies are. I think they're getting better and better. They're looking for very predictable outputs. When a state does it right, when a federal agency does it right, they're now putting those guidelines on you to perform in that manner. So.
Okay. Fantastic. Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I could spend 1 minute on what this, kind of some of the benefits I saw from this. So this was CloudFormation. A lot of this was CloudFormation. Well, it was CloudFormation at the end of the day. And we managed it truly as application code. So we used a code repository, Bitbucket in this case. And I think it gave us a lot of configuration accountability. There's no sneaking in on the terminal and making a change. There's an audit trail of everything you do in there, especially when you're using the code repository tool. And it forced everybody to tie their changes back to Jira tickets. So we kind of had that clear line of sight from here's the request that generated the update in the CloudFormation, that was done, the commit was done on Wednesday and it was deployed on, Thursday night. So that was really good. And the one other benefit we got out of that was the security team, the state security team in particular, wanted to have a lot of visibility into this. Obviously, we're going through a compliance piece. Yep. And we set this up to generate automatic notifications to them anytime somebody committed changes. So they could go directly into Bitbucket and see the changes that were being made in the configuration. So, I mean, that alleviated a lot of us having to go get artifacts and bring it to them. They could just log in, see the changes, see the configurations were in place, security groups are applied, IAM policies are there, without necessarily having to come down and interface with our engineering team. So there was a lot of benefit to that. I mean, that was I've been doing this a long time, and this is a big shift in the way you build for guys like me who are old infrastructure guys.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about the Oracle side of things, but we've avoided some of the nasty stuff. Like the reason why this was kind of a once in a 10-year event is they don't give us money very often to do the underlying infrastructure. So if you're going to do it, you're going to do it right. I think we were still doing with 2003 servers and stuff like that. So one of the mandates out was how can we remove as much of this legacy garbage that was
right.
Can't touch it because it's too important. Well, we're going to touch it, so let's do it correctly. So.
Yep.
Great. So we're just about out of time. We want to save a few minutes for questions, but we started off with the concept of how this was going to benefit the beneficiaries and the workers in the state of California. So the core principle behind all of this was to elevate the human experience. I thought maybe you could share a few thoughts with us about what you accomplished to date on this, and with phase 2 of modernization, what you hope to accomplish with that as well too.
Yeah, so there's no such thing as an IT project. We are IT professionals delivering customer outputs, and so anytime we're talking about a project, we presented it to Medicaid and Health and Human Services. This is about why is this going to benefit their departments, our county users, ultimately our residents of the state. And so this system, CVMS, directly affects 4,500 county users, and then we do a million plus transactions for individual residents online every year. So we have a kind of a customer-centric, which we call peak, and then we have CVMS, which is the county-centric. And this cutover affected both of those pieces. So what does that mean? If the system isn't working, people aren't getting their food stamps, or they're not getting their housing assistance, or they're not getting their cash assistance. So it is major impact. But how does this type of project help with that? Well, the first thing was we improved performance quite a bit in phase 1, which was this migration to AWS. The performance characteristics I did not anticipate, mainly because we were moving so far from the customer. The latency didn't seem impactful. The performance benefit on the database, middleware, and the CPU side, the customers saw it and just their general processing. Phase 2 is taking those, I think it's now 5 million lines of code, and when we go live this summer, it'll be 700,000. So the code complexity, that will translate in benefits in terms of less mistakes, cleaner code. A lot of the code reduction is we're getting out of the framework business of drawing window frames and drop downs and stuff like that, and we're focusing on delivering benefits, right? Rewriting for state compliance or federal compliance. We're doing 100 and something projects every couple of quarters inside of the system, delivering new enhancements to it. So one of the driving factors of this is how can I build a software infrastructure architecture that allows us to deliver more, faster, and ultimately better. And then you're talking, I already talked about it a little bit, you got this COBOL, which goes to JOBOL, which is this kind of, in some cases, clean Java, ugly Java. So you got this very complex software architecture that Deloitte is managing for us, and they're having to bring in engineers, train them on it. So how can I get to software development that allows us to train people faster? And then ultimately, for the county workers, is it a modern UI? When kids are graduating from high school and college and they're coming into the Colorado workforce, do the screens look like they're developed in 2003, or does it look like something they're working with every day? All that pays dividends ultimately to the resident, right? Because we're able to sign them up for benefits faster, reduction in errors, all that stuff.
Yep.
It's all about the resident at this point, right? So
Great. So we're just about on time. We want to spend some time with some questions from the audience, so we'll open up the presentation for questions. Huh? There we go. First one.
Yep. Shall I start over?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah. You had talked in the beginning about sort of a minimum viable product starting with a security level on things. And I was curious about what challenges or considerations went into, like, did you move the concept of identity into the cloud? Are sessions being managed in the cloud? Are these questions not relevant to what you're doing? I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah,
go ahead,
so,
Brian.
We did make some changes there. I mean, when we went to the cloud, obviously we tried to architect for compliance. We did some very we put a couple of components off in VPCs all by themselves because they had FTI data, and we wanted to kind of limit the boundaries. So I mean, there were some there was security considerations put into the architecture. We did add some IAM product. I mean, we had to do some of that, yeah. We had to change some tooling. We added in a couple of different IAM products and proxy products and stuff like that to help us enforce security.
Yeah, but the identity services you guys built, they're in the cloud, but they're also going to be able to support a variety of different enterprise applications. It's not just CBMS, right? So that infrastructure is now in place.
yeah, and the way I interpret the question, minimum viable product is, what is minimum viable in 2019? What is our state cybersecurity standard? So if you're going to make this big move, minimum viable, let's get them up and running with it changing as little as possible while at the same time being in compliance with Mars E2, with our federal guidelines and our state guidelines. That was a big deal. So minimum viable encompassed a lot, right? We had heavy oversight from quite a lot of people. So it ended up being a lot of changes, but we had to make strategic changes. We're not going to do this now because too much risk to the project, and it's not absolutely required, but we have to do this, and it may be high risk, but it's required to get done, and we're going to do it to maintain compliance. So does that make sense?
Yeah, then I think you have a completely modernized system this summer, right? Both pieces. Okay. Next question.
I have a question for David. What was the impact on the IT staff with this whole project, their existing staff?
Yeah, so this project was a major success across the board. So the staff composed of Deloitte, who was helping with the design and integration and the move, and they managed the application for us, so they were key players in this entire process. We had another third party that managed some of the server infrastructure, and then I had my team, which was security architecture and network and stuff like that. This was the project you wanted to be on, right? We talked a little bit earlier in another session, what you're looking for the people that want to raise their hands, right? That want to learn something new. And so in some cases, you're going to bring in an expert, like security architect, right? You don't want someone learning on the job there, right? But there's other disciplines where the staff wanted to be a part of this project, right? They were like, find someone else to take care of this for me. So very exciting. I think we all learned quite a lot as part of the migration, but it was the right balance of people that had done this before combined with people that were learning as they went, and then we had some junior people that got to see it all. So very positive across the board. I don't think the migration to the cloud has been a negative force for my team, primarily because the first year I stood up in front of my team and And it's like, I hear all these rumblings about moving to the cloud, you're scared you're going to lose your job and all that. And it's like,
Yeah.
what did they tell you about virtualization? You're going to lose your job because of virtualization. Now we got more servers we can manage, right? Now we got more server admins we can manage. And like, the network virtualization, we're going to reduce our staff. I was like, I have not seen that. And so you can complain to me after you see it, right? But generally speaking, I think the engineers welcome the opportunity to develop in these new systems, both on the hard technical engineering side and on the software side. I think the development team is very excited about working in these new frameworks. So,
I know we had the conversation earlier today with some other CEOs and CTOs from the state markets. That was a common theme that came out of that conversation, that people are not losing their jobs. It's changing, and in some cases making it a much stronger experience for those, more positive experience for those folks.
I've been doing it for 20 years. It
Yeah.
hadn't happened yet, so we'll see, right?
Yeah.
Maybe with AI.
Maybe. Yep. Next question.
Right here. So quick question, two questions actually. So one is, what were the numbers like from a staff perspective? So how many people did you have on the team during the project ramp up from the Deloitte side, and then on the state side as well? And then in terms of contracts, did you have separate contracts for cloud services provider and for Deloitte as your systems integrator, or did you have one contract?
You want to take the Deloitte side and
Yeah.
I'll take the rest?
Yeah, I can take the staff side for sure.
Yeah.
So the staffing for this was, I mean, we manage the application for them today, so the system admin team is already there and on the project day to day. And I'll be honest, I mean, you need a migration team. I mean, that was my team that came in from cloud consulting and helped do the planning and architecture and migration. I would say that team was probably 10 people in total. But you know, if you don't already have the system admin skill set, that's really the big, I mean, that, to me, that's the really heavy lift, right? I mean, getting it up there, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work involved with building out AWS and understanding all that, but where you know, once you get it there, putting it all back together and making sure your application's working and doing testing and environment certification and database maintenance activities, I mean, that's, you know, that's a pretty good sized team. But for this project, because we're already in that role, we didn't have to staff for that, right? So those people are already on the ground.
Yeah,
I
right.
don't know if I have that exact count.
No,
but
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this is not something you throw people at. You don't solve this problem by throwing people
No,
at it.
no,
We
no.
talked about it earlier on. It's about the process you use to go through the migration and make sure you have proper planning around that. And then tooling's important as well too. But when you have those two pieces in place, you don't need 100 people. You need a small group of dedicated folks to make this happen.
yeah, I mean, you try to leverage as much automation as possible,
Yeah.
right? At this day and age, I mean, that's the big difference in the on-premise data center and the cloud is we're not having to be at the terminal anymore. So
Yeah.
Yeah, on the state side, it was a very flexible team, so we bursted up for our needs, and that's anywhere from the security side to kind of help desk, that type of thing. But also we brought in county workers for testing and training as we go through the different phases. So the team has bursted to the needs, and then they've kind of gone back to their day jobs. Contracts, it was not one contract. I had to unwind some contracts, some nasty contracts. I got to create some new contracts. I got to do some cold calling to AWS. It was an adventurous year. It wasn't overly complex, but I mean, it was, you were changing the way the state had operated for 10 years from a hardware, software perspective and changing some core pieces of the stack. So there was work inside of it, but nothing untenable, so.
You had mentioned that you could talk on the database process all day, and I'm a database nerd, so that sounds good to me. I'm curious about when you were talking about your batch process, how you were running it in parallel. Did you immediately see that it was, you know, as good or better than your previous solution? And if not, you know, what did you end up tweaking? Were you tweaking stuff in the cloud or in the database?
Yeah, fair question, right? So that's why we did it for almost 45 days.
Sure.
I mean, look, it's not an apples to apples comparison, right? You can't go from that specialty hardware that's got a totally different I/O situation going on and all this flash, and you're not going to pick it up and drop it in, and it's just going to work like it does. I mean, I don't care if you put it on the most expensive server they've got, that's still not going to happen, right? So, I mean, part of that process is, the reason we did the like for like batch is so that we could tune at the end of the day, right? So, I mean, we run it, we see, okay, the batch process ran 2 hours longer than it did on-prem, we do some tuning, we do it again the next day, right? Or you have to unwind the database every night. So you roll back and then you do the process again. And this was just an iterative process that we went through until we got to the point where when we went live, nobody was concerned with database performance. I mean, even before, because we had done so much testing around that piece that we were confident that we had solved that problem. So. Yeah, but it won't happen. I mean, when you go on that kind of hardware, you actually detune. I'm not a database guy, by the way, so if I'm butchering this up, well, I hope not. But you detune your database. You take all of the, you don't do maintenance on it really. You just kind of let the hardware take care of it. That's not going to work when you come off.
Yeah, Brian, I don't know if this is right, but one of the benefits of the cloud, you can do all this testing. The cost model is great for doing this sort of thing.
Absolutely.
It wasn't costing an arm and a leg to do all the tuning.
Right.
Yeah, so we could spend the time and go through the iteration and get it right. I think we have time for one more question.
All right, last question then. I mean, what you guys built here sounds kind of like a cloud nirvana sort of state. Have you seen a knock-on effect with other agencies? Are you guys sort of a center of excellence within Colorado? Are people coming to talk to you about it? And if so, what are those conversations like?
So I think the question was around kind of, has this had a knock-on effect to other agencies, and how is my organization structured? Colorado is a pretty centralized, you call it shared service state, so all the IT personnel at the agencies report up through my organization. So that doesn't mean we're dictators to our agencies. So what you're doing is trying to identify compelling solutions that the agencies want to consume. And so we did that both in our hybrid cloud in-house infrastructure. A lot of data center agencies had servers in their closets and things they called data centers, which were under bathrooms, things like that. And so we won them over with compelling technology stacks, both here and in this project, right? And we didn't just jump to AWS. We did it with some smaller solutions. We saw the success both in performance, delivery, price, and then we're taking them to larger solutions. And now you got agencies asking how they can follow that. So yes, there is a knock-on effect, but the knock-on effect comes from delivering better, faster, cheaper, right? And more repeatable. So that's what you're going for. And my agency is not perfect in that, but you got to fail fast. And when you identify bad stacks or bad solutions or vendors that aren't working, you got to remove them and focus on the ones that are working for you.
Great. Well, that concludes our presentation today. David, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Ryan, you as well.
Yeah.
We'll be around the podium for a few more minutes afterwards. If you have some questions come up, we're more than happy to take your questions. So thanks everybody for joining us, and enjoy the show.